No, that's the thesis of people like Whitehead and Michael Foster. Descartes' thesis is that logically, it's a logical thesis, not a historical one, logically, since God is good, okay, premise, since God is good, and he offers in the previous meditation a proof for that, you see. But if God is good, then what God does is good. And so the abilities, the faculties God has given us are reliable, or God would be deceiving us, and that wouldn't be good, you see. A good God does not deceive, does not give us deceptive faculties. So his is a logical justification rather than a historical argument. Okay? All right. I'm ready then to move on to Descartes himself. How about it? Okay? What we have in the anthology is the Meditations, probably his most influential work. In fact, if you read the editor's introductory comments, Kaufmann's introductory comments, before you get into the Meditations, he makes the observation that it's this work which was the starting point for the philosophy later on of Benedict Spinoza, of the French philosopher Malebranche, of Leibniz. Tremendously influential point of reference. Moreover, to this day, Descartes is probably the most regarded French philosopher before the 20th century, and in the 20th century still the most highly regarded French philosopher. It seems to be characteristic that when people lecture at the Sorbonne for the first time, they all pay their homage to René Descartes, you see. He's such a towering figure. But you might, as you read the Meditations, realize almost at once that for all of the contrast between Hobbes and, for that matter, Bacon and Descartes, there is a strong point of similarity initially between Bacon and Descartes. You see, Bacon really begins in his discussion of how we know by casting down all the idols. Remember? The idols of the cave, the idols of the market, the idols of so on and so forth. That is to say, faulty assumptions and faulty methods. He does not trust either the philosophical and scientific methods of the past or the philosophical beliefs of the past. They're all subject to doubt. Now that's Bacon. But Descartes, in that regard, is virtually the same. Because the first meditation in Descartes' Meditations is precisely on his part simply an attempt to expound on the thesis, I doubt, and to give reasons for doubt. You see. Now, what they're doing should, in the historical context by now, be pretty obvious. Remember what we said about the epistemological vacuum created by the breakdown of scholastic methodology. Remember about the rise of skepticism again, you see. And what both Bacon and Hobbes are doing, therefore, is paying serious attention to the skeptic's objections to existing methods of knowing and existing beliefs, paying serious attention. And as it were, identifying a skeptic, identifying with the skeptical position. And by devising a new method, breaking out of skepticism into a new era of philosophical inquiry. So there's a sense in which both of them are conceding the skeptic's point about science and philosophy to date, you see. But to say that science and philosophy to date are questionable does not imply that science and philosophy in the future are always going to be questionable, if we can find the right kind of method. And that's precisely what they're trying to do. Bacon coming up with a much more careful kind of empirical method than has been used previously. And Descartes coming up with a kind of analysis and logical method that he thinks has been operative in mathematics, about which these skeptics weren't skeptical in his day, apparently. Now, Sextus Empiricus, the Roman skeptic, actually had written a work against the mathematicians. Descartes never questions the nature of mathematical reasoning. Well, never questions it. He does, yes, but it's mathematical reasoning which has been open to least doubt, to most consensus, simply because of the nature of a mathematical proof. In other words, if you can break up subject matter into a succession of individual judgments, propositions, and organize them in logical order, beginning with what is intuitively, axiomatically self-evident, and proceeding by deductive inference, you see, that's what mathematics does. Then what you can have is really hard knowledge. Now, at this level of the new method, the big difference between Bacon's new method and Descartes' new method is this: that in the empiricist strain, where the premises are empirical generalization, okay, when the premises are empirical generalizations, what you have is evidence, perhaps probability, but no certainty. But in Descartes' tradition, if the premises are self-evident, intuitive, what you have is complete certainty. As he says, beyond all doubt. Certainty, indubitable, which means cannot be doubted. Indubitable first premises. Now, the result is that if by this method you are trying to justify certain conclusions, you're trying to justify believing that certain conclusions are true, the most you have on the empirical line is going to be probability. You see? And an approach, therefore, to justification of beliefs, which in today's epistemology is known as evidentialism. And we'll be seeing more of that in John Locke in first week of school in January. Okay, John Locke's evidentialism. John Locke, in fact, says that you should proportion your belief to the evidence. You see. On the other hand, Descartes, with his indubitable certainty, he lays the basis for the approach to justification of beliefs which today is called foundationalism. Where what's called the hard foundationalist, sometimes the strong foundationalist, is trying to say that yes, we do have indubitable first principles and therefore indubitably certain conclusions. And the weak or soft foundationalist is likely to soften that if the premises are a little bit softer than certain, logically or intuitively certain. Okay? So you hear a great deal in talk of epistemology today, and if you're around Jay Wood or any of his classes, you'll hear it constantly, because this is his special interest. Talk of justification of belief, foundationalism, evidentialism, and this is where the difference arises. It arises in the difference of starting point for a deductive system, whether in Baconian induction, as it were, and empirical premises, or in Descartes' mathematical-like axioms. Okay, clear enough? And incidentally, what you say about justification of beliefs generally applies in areas like apologetics, because Christian apologetics is simply an attempt to provide justification for believing certain Christian beliefs. You see, so the same strategies are involved. In fact, it would be possible to trace the history of Christian apologetics by tracing the history of epistemology, because apologetics is just applied epistemology, at least when it's done reflectively about method. It's simply applied epistemology. Okay. All right, so meditation 1 then develops what we usually call methodological skepticism. And in your reading of it, notice several of the reasons that Descartes gives for that kind of skepticism that he adopts because of his method. Notice the relativity of sense perception. The relativity of sense perception. Nothing new there. I mean, we've talked about that ever since the pre-Socratics. Plato talked about it. The empiricist recognizes the relativity of sense perception, you see, relative to observation conditions, relative to the observer, relative to time as well as place, so forth. Second, he employs the hypothesis that perhaps God deceives us. Or if God doesn't deceive, perhaps there is some malign spirit, some malign demon deceiving us. So that what we think to be so, what we think we see, is not so at all. Is that possible? You see. At least it's a hypothetical possibility. How realistic a possibility is another question. But if you want something beyond all doubt, you have to lay to rest even the most hypothetical of possibilities, if you're after that kind of certainty. So watch for that.